Hi, everyone. Hope everyone is doing well. This is the Canadian Foreign Policy Hour, which is a critical look at Canada's role abroad. And we're at about 156th week, according to my thing. I'm coming to you from Jojage, which has long been a meeting place of various First Nations, otherwise known as Montreal. And there are many developments in Canadian foreign policy this week. There's a piece I read, I think it may have been posted about 10 days ago, but I just read it a few days ago on Ricochet from Brandy Morin, who is doing a four-part series in Ecuador and about a Canadian mining company. Big, long, long piece that weaves in the recent free trade agreement and Indigenous opposition to the free trade agreement and how it's being viewed as very much further strengthening Canadian mining companies' power in Ecuador. The Globe and Mail business section had a front page story a few days ago saying, headline, two former employees advising Mali's junta, Barrick's CEO says. So basically, Barrick's complaining that there's former Barrick employees that are providing information presumably on how the company operates, how much it's making, whether it's avoiding taxes, avoiding royalties, etc. And Barrick is not happy about this. And that's dispute going on over hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars between the Mali government and Barrick Gold, and they've actually physically taken Barrick Gold bars, and they're trying to arrest the CEO of Barrick, who's of course not in the country. The Globe had a story saying that Canada is withdrawing a small number of peacekeepers that are part of the UN mission in Eastern Congo. It's I'm not sure if they said the exact number, but it's a very small number. It's like six or four or 10 or something like that. But they say that they are in sort of upper echelon positions, and they say, I think importantly, that Canada's withdrawal has the possibility, the potential of spurring other countries to withdraw. And we've just seen in the last 24, 48 hours that the Rwanda-backed forces have taken over Bukavu, which is the second biggest city in eastern Congo. I think it's around 1 million people. So they took Goma about maybe it's 2 weeks ago now, and so they're marching on. So this is the big step forward. They haven't. My understanding is the M23 has not taken that city yet. Historically, they took Goma briefly back in 2012. Um, and so they are, it looks like increasing likelihood that this is going to be a march all the way to Kinshasa, which is about 1,500 kilometers away. And there's a bunch of the different countries. I believe it was Namibia, or maybe it was Malawi actually. Malawi that had a couple soldiers killed and that withdrew their forces from the SADC, the Southern Africa, the alliance of Southern African countries. And there's talk, of course, of South Africa removing its troops. Now, whether Canada should have sent troops or not, and the UN mission Eastern Congo, and some of those questions, I think is a kind of those are interesting questions to have. But in amidst a aggression from Rwanda into Eastern Congo, Canada withdrawing troops is a obvious boon to Rwanda, and it's a blow to the government in Kinshasa, and so in that sense, I think it's a very bad development, and it speaks to how the Canadian government is fine with Kigali invasion and destabilization and the like. I just before coming on, I was listening to this to repeat a point I made last week, but just listening to it again. This Kenyan Prof Lumumba. He's got very well sort of done um, YouTube clips, and he's this Pan-Africanist, alleged. He's at the law school in Nairobi, uh, and and just listening to his description of what's going on in Eastern Congo, And apparently, he had a kerfuffle. He spoke at the Economic Freedom Fighters convention in South Africa, the which is this left wing South African group, which from what I can tell is generally quite good politically, and uh, and he spoke at their convention back in last year and a half ago, or something like that. And apparently, there was a big controversy over his position against basic in support of Uganda's. I think it was, I don't know if it was exactly full support or the specifics, but in support in some way of Uganda's homophobic laws that are pretty extreme against gay people, and and so apparently there's a big controversy over that because from my understanding, Economic Freedom Fighters is this sort of leftist force, which I think is somewhat rare on the continent, where they're also, pro LGBTQ and sort of quite, progressive on, let's call it, social issues. And so him speaking when he had this position. Now, he is apparently, he says, according to this thing I saw, he's a friend of Kagame's. And listening to his description, he's framing all this in this anti-colonial pan-Africanist frame. His description of what's going on in Congo is absolutely disgusting. It's total Anglo-East African imperialism. It's listening to it, it's totally fascinating to watch this sort of like Ugandan, Rwandan. Of course, Rwanda, Kagame is actually Ugandan, right? He grew up in Uganda. Anglo speaking, wasn't a French speaker, which was, of course, the language of the Belgian rule in Rwanda. And part of the thing he did is he shifted the second language to being English. And so he would have this like this Anglo, obviously Kenya being an Anglo and framing this anti-French, I'm totally sympathetic to anti-French, French imperialism in Africa remains a very powerful force and remains a destructive force. I'm totally sympathetic to criticism of that. But when you do that in an Anglo environment with basically nothing about UK, US, Canadian imperialism, and you are like a cheerleader for Kagame, essentially a cheerleader for Kagame in Congo. I'm sorry, but that's just you are not a Pan-Africanist. You are a force of imperialism and horror. I mean, and again, you cannot be a Pan-Africanist and have any association with Paul Kagame, who has the most African blood on his hand. Paul Kagame is centrally involved in overthrowing three different governments in '86 in Uganda, in 90, sorry, in 86 in Uganda, 94 in Kigali, and then 97 in Kinshasa. And he's just basically been at war with other Africans since he was 20, and he was trained at the U.S. Fort Leavenworth in Kansas. So the idea that this can be framed, and again, I repeated this last night, the variation of this last week, but to see this sort of pseudo Pan-African and to go further with the economic freedom fighters, the idea that there would be a controversy over this guy's support for homophobic laws, but it wouldn't be a controversy over what is his own stated friendship with Paul Kagame, the guy with the most African blood on his hands over the past 30 years, is remarkable. And it speaks to, quite frankly, it speaks to actually the power of the West in making things controversial, and whipping up a big storm about Uganda's homophobic laws versus the West whipping up a big storm about Paul Kagame and the horrors this person has committed in Congo principally, but elsewhere as well. Anyways, shifting gears, Canadian International Development Minister Ahmed Hussein was in Dhaka in Bangladesh, meeting with the Mohammed Yunus, who is the leader sort of taken over since Sheikh Hasina was ousted. So I presume that's sort of Canada. I haven't followed it very closely, but Canada kind of agreeing with that. Also, similar kind of development. Trudeau congratulates The headline of the story: Trudeau congratulates Syrian interim leader despite terrorist listing. So Trudeau had a conversation with which was who's Al Jolani, and now his name is Ahmed Al Shara, who is the former head of or the head of the Canadian government listed terrorist organization HTS. And so Trudeau is sort of all part of this process of kind of bringing these former Al Qaeda type into the fold as I guess a legitimate leader or whatever. Um, Unifor, I talked about this last week about this Le Devoir article from the head of Unifor Quebec about this calling for a world-class Canadian arms industry firm and calling on the Canadian government to support that. So this week, the government announced a big training project for the Canadian pilots for the F-35s, and it's given to CAE, which is a Montreal firm. I uh, I wanted to go out. I was at the CA office a couple of weeks ago, and the procurement minister Duclos was there giving it. Anyways, I wasn't able to make it out to this thing, but I sort of followed this, and then the Unifor Quebec put out a press release, put on the wire, paid for a press release on the wire, so probably $1,000 or something like that, and it says Unifor Québec salue le contrat de formation des CF-35A accordé à CAE et rappelle l'importance d'un approvisionnement stratégique pour l'aérospatiale canadienne. So basically, it supports it celebrates this contract for CAE. Now, I understand a union that represents CAE workers can't really come out and say, we're going to criticize a contract to our firm that's going to provide a whole bunch of work for our members. Now, but it doesn't have to come out and celebrate this contract, and it can say something in the press release about the F-35 and question marks around the F-35. And even according to the union's own position, the F-35s violates their quite pro-militarist, and I'll get that in a second, but their pro-militarist position because their focus is calling for the IRB, the Industrial Research and regional IB and regional benefits. Basically, that if a foreign company gets a contract from a procurement contract, it has to put an equal amount of money into different Canadian initiatives. So that's the standard for Canadian military procurement. But the F-35 violates that. It breaks that. It's this whole big, long, complicated, that's the joint uh, strike task or task strike force, whatever. Anyway, Lockheed Martin's big project, which opens up contracts to Canadian companies. And but it's based upon a whole completely different formula. So, Canada could spend 20 million, pay 20 million to Lockheed Martin, and Canadian companies might get 2 billion, they might get 10 billion, they might get 5 billion, they might get 20 billion in contracts, but that's based upon Lockheed Martin's desires, not based upon fulfilling the requirements of standard military procurement. And so the union calls for that all over. That's considered to be a central part of what the union is calling for on on military procurement, particularly in the aerospace sector. But they don't bring that up, so I went and then started looking. I just wrote a piece about Unifor because I talked about this last week, and then there's this development, and I went and looked at what some of the stuff they're doing. They put out a aerospace policy back in September that's basically, I mean, it celebrates military spending. The front of the thing is an image of a fighter jet, right? So you have Lana Payne, who's supposedly this like progressive Unifor leader, uh, who she's like photoed releasing the thing with with a document in her hand of this basically a fighter jet, and that's the union's aerospace policy. So Unifor has come out. They supported the Lockheed Martin Joint Strike Force project going back multiple years, and they're celebrating this recent contract to train Canadian pilots on that fighter jet. Now, people have emailed me, if there was going to be a thing that Canada did in response to Trump's threats, one of the most straightforward things to do would be to say, okay, we're putting pause on the F-35, right? The F-35 purchase was a huge stop to the U.S. arms military industrial complex, specifically Lockheed. And that would be if you were trying to demonstrate some independence and trying to message to Trump that we're not just going to roll over, this would be something that you would do. And this is certainly something the union that claims to be so concerned about the tariffs of Trump. It's certainly something they could raise. They could sort of throw it out there, and you don't have to do it in a definitive way, but you could say, okay, yes, we like CAE getting a contract because we represent the workers there to train Canadian pilots, but we're not sure about this F-35 project because of the procurement rules, but also because maybe Donald Trump, maybe this is a bargaining chip we have, whatever, right? None of that's there because they've completely, it seems like, bought into Canadian militarism and as I go into the piece, Canadian imperialism and quite frankly, Canadian capitalism more generally. In researching this, I found quite a good piece from the Briar Patch from a couple months ago, headline on breaking and not breaking the war machine, which is basically looking at unions and the difficulties unions have in some of these questions. And they're legitimate. I don't. It's not a simple. Well intentioned people within unions have some serious difficulties in dealing with these questions. When members are quite frankly, a lot of the unionized private sector stuff is, it's producing arms and oil and cars and all kinds of things that are really we should be producing much less of. So there are real questions and difficulties for union members and activists and leaders. The Hill Times has a piece about Radio Canada International, and basically saying that there's a memo suggesting that it should be transferred to Global Affairs Canada. So right now it's sort of a branch of CBC, and it should be transferred. And so that goes back historically, right? It was just a branch of then External Affairs, and it was Canada's propaganda arm. And I think it's kind of, it played this big role in stoking Ukrainian nationalism during the time of the Soviet Union and other Eastern European nationalisms during the time of the Cold War as a way to try to weaken the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc and the like. It's interesting to see that it may go right back to its historical roots as an official propaganda arm of Global Affairs. On the front of the Globe, one of the last couple of days, the headline, the article says Pete Hegseth, the U.S. Secretary of Defense, laid out a vision of a peace deal that appeared to grant the Russian leader his key war aims, letting Moscow keep the territory it has captured, while also barring Kyiv from joining the NATO military alliance. I thought that was quite interesting to see that now the Globe Mail's admitting that a key war aim was the NATO joining NATO. That's not something that they have admitted has been a key war aim going back 3 years. But now this seems to be willing to recognize what is obviously true. And what we've seen this week was Trump with a conversation with Putin and speech by Hegseth in the Munich, at the Ukraine contact group. And they're basically saying the starting premise of negotiation is recognizing reality, which is there's not going to join NATO and is not going back to 2014 borders. And that's caused a huge storm. Christian Freeland tweeted, Canada stands steadfast with Ukraine and the brave people of Ukraine who are on the front lines of the fight against tyranny. It is the interests of all democracies to support them. Ukraine must become a full member, a full NATO member. So Friedland is repeating, doubling down, they must be a NATO member. That was, of course, was the Canadian position. Joly, right in the midst of the negotiations in January 2022, Joly was running around saying, Ukraine's going to join NATO. We support this. Totally just adding fuel to the fire. None of this justifies Russia's invasion, but this was all provocative. It was all understood what it meant, what it was likely to contribute to. Canadian officials didn't care. Friedland, who apparently cares so much about Ukraine, is basically taking the position that we're just going to keep going on forever. And I did an interview with Paul Robinson, the prof at University of Ottawa, about some of these developments in. He's a Russia expert, Eastern European guy, and I interviewed him on my YouTube and CFPI YouTube, and he's pointing out that this is really like it's I don't use the word spoiler. I think it's a slightly different term he used, but basically Canada in efforts to end the war, there are forces that can be basically spoilers, and Canada would be in that group. Potentially the Baltic states could be there. Poland, basically trying to just you know take what is a difficult negotiation and cause problems for that. Clearly, Chrystia Freeland, that would be her intent, and this would all be framed as the pro-Ukraine position, which would just mean more and more death. And I just read a story a couple hours ago. One of the Daily Mail, the British stories, Kachinovsky posted it. And basically, Trump has offered this deal. People have probably heard about the exchange for the rare earths and strategic minerals that Trump's, I guess, initially Zelensky brought this up to Trump, and now Trump's, has been brought up. Well, we're gonna we get these. I guess we get them for free, we get them some discount. Not exactly clear what the deal would be, how it was being framed, but that basically in exchange for all the money that the U.S. has given, they would get this deal on minerals in Ukraine. Now, according to this article, it's a way more expansive. And basically, the Trump administration is like put some plan on the table that it gave to Zelensky a week ago that's like $500 billion. And basically, the US, basically, Ukraine would just be a colony of the US. And half of all like government revenue would just go to Washington. They get all the minerals. They get I think some of the grain stuff like. So it's just this wildly. I mean, Ukraine would never get out from under the thumb of its debt, according to this story. Now, it's probably just a sort of extreme kind of Trump negotiating kind of a thing, but it speaks to how that's what's the win, right? What does Ukraine win? You get just so many people killed, so much of the territory destroyed, and then you become a vassal of Washington or the EU, or that's what's the seems to be on offer. And the longer this goes on, those dynamics just worsen. Now, I'm not saying the alternative is great either from Ukraine. Losing whatever proportion of your territory is not a good solution either. But at some point, there's got to be some sense of cutting your losses, especially when Russia keeps gaining. They keep getting more territory. It's slow, but they keep advancing. Um, there was a story in antiwar.com about the Arctic and how basically Russia and Canada have the same position on countries traversing the sea routes that they consider their sovereign internal waters, and how the U.S. doesn't agree with that, and then also goes into the fact that the U.S. doesn't agree with it, but then hasn't actually ratified the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. And so that's part of the Northwest Passage and tension with the U.S. over that is kind of like left out of all this discussion in Canada about um, the Arctic and Arctic security and militarizing the Arctic and the need to, Polyev does this proposal, and so we're this is all about we're setting up a military base in Iqaluit based upon uh, China and Russia, but it's really the U.S. where there's disagreement, and um, and that whole question. Now, another interesting thing that I saw a bunch this week is that there's starting to be some dissent, starting to build up here of military types who are now admitting that the U.S. is a threat. So Norman, I'm forgetting his first name. He was former number two in the Canadian Forces. He's calling on Ottawa to. This is from a French article. That it should look into the Article 4 of NATO, which is it's sort of um, like a potential threat, and uh, and so he's sort of saying like, well, we got to raise Trump's annexation threats with NATO, and so that's starting to go down that path. One of the Calgary Sun columnists, a Braid. Now, this is all interesting. Canada needs a wartime military to defend against Trump. Americans should finally realize that we may not be big, but we're damn tough. So he's starting to talk about um, Canadian military spending as a response to Trump. Now, this can be a just a new justification for military spending, but we're starting to see some of that. But we're seeing that division also. Okay, so on the flip side, so you have Rick Hillier, who posts, who's the former chief of the defense staff, who was a whole bunch of ties to the U.S. Texas and trained in, I think he might have been in Kansas as well. He says, in response to the whole hockey booing, I'd love to see the Canadian team go all of them and stand shoulder to shoulder with the U.S. team as soon as the Star Spangled Banner starts at the Four Nation game on Saturday night. Be classy. So he's basically freaking out about the people booing the U.S. national anthem and calling for so this is a guy who claims he's all about defending Canada. Now, similarly, Bill Blair in this direction, who is the defense minister, of course. So Trudeau a week ago, 10 days ago, says, Trump's really serious. This is real. He really wants to annex Canada. Da da da. Where in that speech to 150 business leaders or whatever, which was like caught on he went on the loudspeaker while the journalists were supposedly left, but it was I presumably meant for the media to hear, but not, trying to play a little game of not directly saying it to the media, but knowing the media would hear it. Anyway, so that's after Trudeau says that. Bill Blair then says um, Trudeau's 51st state talk is not a real threat. Defense minister says. Blair says comments are disrespectful and concerning, but not serious. Um, so he is taking the different position. So he's kind of trying to say, oh no, 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 it's not a real threat. Now, I understand why the defense minister would say that. This would completely um, uh, throw up in air the whole structure of the Canadian military and the Department of National Defense if you were to take seriously Trump's threats. But then, so in this interview, he then goes. So then he gets asked. This is a little. I'm not sure what paper it was, but he gets asked about the whole Trump saying it should be 5% of GDP and military spending. And so he says, even the United States does not spend 5% of its GDP on defense. The United States is a superpower, and they're able to project their power and authority around the world for many of the NATO allies, including Canada. So here you have Bill Blair saying the U.S. spends huge amounts of money on the military to, in part, protect Canada. Um, I don't think that's correct, but that's he's still, so he's on one hand he's denying the seriousness of Trump's threats, and on the other hand he's saying that U.S. military spending is partly about protecting Canada. Nonetheless, we're seeing some, I would say, some significant changes in the rhetoric around how serious I'm talking about in military circles about Trump's threats. So there was a story, I think it was on The Conversation or The Hub, and it was titled "Why Annexing Canada Would Destroy the United States." And basically says that there would be an insurgency, and it compares it to other insurgencies, and it would just be the U.S. get bogged down, and he goes into some numbers of the proportion of Canadian soldiers that would fight the insurgency and the proportion of former soldiers that would fight, and basically argues that it would be a disaster for the U.S. I think it's highly speculative, but the basic point here is it wouldn't just be so easy as though the U.S. has a big military, marches north, and all is easy. Um, and but the fact that that stuff's even being kind of like put out there has to be rippling through the Canadian military, right? These Canadian soldiers who are down in the States who are doing all these different initiatives with U.S. troops, it has to be rippling through their thinking, and got to be making a lot of these people very uncomfortable. There was a story, a National Post story that pointed out, so Trump brings in aluminum tariffs, okay? And so 60% of US aluminum imports, I believe, are from Canada, mostly from here in Quebec. And so they say this, and this is like a really doesn't make much sense as a industrial policy. And apparently, this National Post story says, no, I knew that the Quebec, and maybe also in, I think it's in Trail in BC, but the Quebec aluminum was heavily tied. Americans put a bunch of money into it, I think during World War II or just before World War II. And but this story says that they actually consider it officially by US law as being part of the US industrial base, Quebec's aluminum. So they're putting big tariffs on this. And so also kind of in the vein of some of this stuff, this US discussion, uh, there was a journal, Le Devoir column by a former, or I think he's an honorary Canadian colonel, some very establishment. They run some group called Canadians Stand Together, Our True North Strong and Free. It's an initiative of some think tank or this person operates. I checked out the site very briefly. What I found interesting about this column is they bring in Gaza. Not much, but they bring in Gaza. So they bring in, as part of this sort of like nationalistic, the ugly American Trump is trying to push us around. They also bring in Gaza, and also Tanya, is it Tanya Talaga, who's the Globe and Mail. She's an indigenous columnist in the Globe, who hasn't touched, from what I can tell, nothing. Palestine, Gaza, total silence. Uh, but in this week's column, dealing with Trump, she does also brings in Gaza. And I'm curious to see how far this will go. I think that's something we want to be pushing is the sort of making, Canadian nationalism that's the upsurge, bringing in a pro-Palestine part of it, an anti-genocide as part of the anti-Trump thing, and seeing little bits of that. Another thing on the whole Trump thing is there's a Puglisi, I believe it's Puglisi, an Ottawa citizen, has a story titled "D&D Confident F-35 Purchase Won't Be Derailed by Elon Musk." And so he has a piece on this and on the surface combatants naval ship about now the piece on the F-35 is sort of saying, oh, we should be concerned the Americans might like undercut the purchase. Now, of course, it should be the other way around, where the Canadian government should say, okay, as part of a bargaining chip, we're pulling back on the F-35. On the surface combatants, it's a bit different in that it's Irving shipping that's the main player there. Huge $80 billion upfront. And they decided to turn, according to this Puglisi story, they decided to turn to the Americans for a big chunk of the operating systems and stuff. I know they're getting the Tomahawk missiles. A big chunk of it ends up being kind of commissioned from, I think, Lockheed Martin, I believe is the firm. And there's a sort of like basically saying that all upgrades would have to be contingent on the US going forward. So by choosing to go with the Lockheed, they then kind of tie the Canadian Navy to future dependencies with the US. So, in a context where you get talking about annexation, the idea, I mean, now presumably the Canadian government, the Canadian military could just break these agreements and figure out ways of violating the contract they signed and all that kind of stuff if things really went off the rails in terms of conflict between US and Canada. But the just the that kind of dependency is seems like a not a very good idea. Maybe never was a good idea, but particularly in this case. But it's all because, of course, these the F-35s and the surface combatants, they're not being purchased to defend Canada. They're being purchased to extend the U.S. empire. So it's totally coherent from what has been the Canadian military's basic position for 60, 70 years. Um, but it's being put into question more in recent days. Um, Now, the premiers were down in Washington. All the premiers went down, and apparently it was sort of an embarrassing, pretty low level. Trump officials met with them, and it was not really very successful, and this and that. And one of the stories I saw that they said that the premiers really doubling down on China being the economic enemy. That was a really big part of their pitch. We're together against China. We got to be stick together against China, and Canada, U.S. can be together and be against China and bad China, and we can, get China, whatever. Okay, that's Doug Ford has really been pushing that all over, and you see that with lots of different Canadian political leaders in response to Trump's threats. Um, Now, counter to that, flipping that, is there is a proposal Canada join the EU. Now, joining the EU wouldn't be uh, a direct geopolitical challenge to the US, though I don't think the US would be happy about Canada joining the EU. Uh, that's being floated by, I think, Toronto Star has floated it and brought up a few places. Um, the Tyee had a piece headlined, "Should Canada be ready to switch sides?" Iconoclastic economist Jeff Rubin argues Canada might need to ally with Russia or China as the US turns away. And so Rubin, who was the former head of CIBC World Markets, very prominent, Canadian capitalist economist, he's viewed as having, broken away from the, Bay Street kind of whatever. But nonetheless, he's a player still, I believe, in that world. And he's basically saying in this piece that Canada should join BRICS or should move in that direction. Um, so now that's the BRICS wouldn't take Canada. I don't believe that's like it's not a something on the agenda in any serious way. But it is, I think, should be something that should be put out there as part of the public conversation, and as part of bargaining with Washington, and as part of just breaking out of the U.S. geopolitical orbit, which would be very healthy for the Canadian mainstream political discussion, and even, quite frankly, left wing political discussion. We're seeing very little of even let alone the geopolitical element, like union leaders saying that, like, as part of the response to Trump, we should be targeting U.S. profit hubs, right? U.S. has huge uh, surplus in services, which is a complicated what a service is exactly in terms of selling services to Canada than the other way around. But things like Netflix, and that's an obvious. But also other side to it, a lot of this is the whole patents question, right? And the pharmaceuticals. Canada's basically boosted its patent uh, uh, rights, or its length and strength of patents, um, at the behest of Washington, as part of so-called free trade negotiations, and that's a huge boon to U.S. pharmaceutical companies. So when you're talking about how you're going to respond to Trump, one part of the equation should be like highly profitable areas. Like, we're going to like hurt, wealthy billionaire U.S. Figures as part of our response, which might be changing patent rules. Now, that's completely outside of the box of how the discussion is taking place so far. But certainly, like, social democratic labor leaders can be talking like that. Can be, I'm not, you could, obviously you could go down that path and say, well, our response to Trump's threats is we're just going to nationalize all U.S. capital in Canada. That's where, if you had a real, like revolutionary anti-capitalist movement, that's the kind of stuff you would start talking about. But I'm saying, well, that's way, 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 way far from where we are right now. But like in the here and now, labor leaders can start talking about things like, because, if you talk about the more profitable U.S. businesses in Canada, or sale of services, you're also doing a class element, and you don't want to necessarily hurt U.S. working class, right? So you're bringing that into the equation, and you're thinking about these things from not just a nationalistic standpoint, but from a class standpoint. And also, I think, honestly, just from a strictly bargaining position standpoint, I don't know enough about, like who the power players are around Trump. The obvious one that's been brought up is bringing 100% tariffs on Tesla, right? So as a way to, go at Elon Musk, that's been raised, and that's something that should be thought about. And I think it's good to add that to the conversation, but that conversation should be much broader than that, in terms of some sort of uh, corporate profit, capitalist, whatever you want to call that exactly. Quite frankly, questioning some element of property rights, even if it's really mild in the sense of just weakening patents. That's something that should be part of the discussion. Moving on to the Palestine element. So Jolie posted yesterday that she met with her Israeli counterpart to discuss implementing the ceasefire. So she's still meeting with these genociders. There was a Twitter post about this another Canadian who joined the Israeli military who died, didn't die in fighting, according to this post at least. And someone posted that there was at least two others that had joined the Israeli military, have died in the past 16 months. And I posted, and I think it's an important point, is that there's all these Canadians fighting, right? There's all these dozens, hundreds. We know it's certainly hundreds in recent years. We don't know how many exactly have been, killing in Gaza recently. It's certainly dozens, probably hundreds. And that whole question of like them being investigated under Canadian law around um, uh, war crimes, and that's something that needs to be hammered uh, and brought up. The National Council Came Muslims had an action alert, which was about calling on people to call for listing the Jewish Defense League as a terrorist organization. And it kind of makes me a bit uncomfortable, because was a number of elements to it. First of all, I think the terrorist list we should just, get rid of the terrorist list. Now, I get why you would, if the list exists and you want to flip the script and say this JDL, these violent crowd here, they should be listed. I get that. but the other part to me, but beyond the kind of questioning the terrorist list, the other part to me that doesn't makes me a bit uncomfortable on this is that I don't think they come out in defense of Samidu, right? So I find that like, so here you have a grassroots group, Canadian group that gets listed, that gets, very limited uh, uh, defense from the broad Palestine movement. There was some defense, but it was fairly limited, and we messed up. We should have been way more proactive. And I still think we could have actually deterred the government from to listing Samidoun, because I think they really took a long time to consider it, and that was because there's really big problems in them doing it. But I just find that a bit like um, I don't know if the word is cowardly, but you don't defend this outrageous listing of a Canadian group because you're nervous, right? You don't want to get, that's once they get listed, they get deemed terrorist. Samuel gets deemed terrorist. It's like, oh, now you're associating with terrorists, and then there was the whole kerfuffle about the October 7th and die Canada, death to the US, death to Israel, death to Canada, or whatever happened at that demo that was so scary. So they did a whole job, and it was all right. Sammy Dune was demonized. Anyway, so I just thought that that's uh I think that whole conversation, it goes to the whole conversation. I'm made really uncomfortable by how much conversation there is in at demonstrations and stuff about supporting the Palestinian armed resistance, and then like no discussion of the fact that Canada has, first of all, criminalized all these Palestinian armed resistance. So like, rather than saying we support the armed resistance, our demand should be we support Canada ending the listing of the armed resistance, because that's a actual demand of our government and of our political culture, and whatever. But then even beyond that, a thing like Samidoun. So there's like so little about like defending Samidoun, and so it's like, and I think that like there's there's different principal elements to that. One of the principal elements that I think is important is that I it's a demand that has a political, you're making a request of the local power when you deal with the Canadian terrorist list. But also I think that like, and this would be viewed as somewhat more liberal in that it's not the revolutionary position is not just to like stake out, I support the armed resistance. It's to have an impact. And I think that the I support the armed resistance is a much more marginalizing position than, I don't believe that a grassroots Vancouver group should be listed as a terrorist organization by the Canadian government. That's a much more, so like strategically, it doesn't the I support the armed resistance is not a very strategic position, and then it doesn't even make a demand of the local power. So it seems like a, what's the intent here? And I get, that I think people should, as a abstraction, support the armed resistance. Obviously, the thing that's going to stop the killing machine, I would love to believe it was like our rallies in Montreal and rallies, like, but what's clearly causes the killing machine of Zionism to pause is Hamas fighters. I totally agree with that, but that doesn't necessarily to go from that point to how do we deal with this question politically in Canada. Those are two very different things. Anyway, so the National Council of Canadian Muslims thing on the terrorist list and the JDL kind of, I think, fits in some of that discussion that needs to really be opened up a bit more. Quickly, there was a very good piece in La Presse about what happened at the Dawson College, and also I think at the John Abbott, the other English college. The higher education minister in Quebec, Pascal Derry, she apparently, so 3 or 4 months ago, she called for an investigation into these cegeps, the colleges. And Dawson's the biggest college. It's Anglo here on the western side of downtown. It's got like 10, 12,000. It's big. It'd be as big as many universities, I believe, across the country. Uh, and uh, and she called for an investigation because like basically Jewish students were saying they felt uncomfortable and blah 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 blah. They had a strike in November. After that, they had a very good, the vote was pretty good. It was a good like 450 to 200 or something like that at the General Assembly. It was not like as decisive as the recent one in Concordia, but it was like two-thirds at least. And total panic from the Zionist groups and whatever. Anyways, they did a big campaign about the Jewish students feeling uncomfortable at Dawson, da da da. And so this higher education minister calls for an investigation, and she goes down to the point. Apparently, they have some class that's just like, not it's a completely elective whatever class that deals with like the history of Palestine. And the education minister gets right involved for like an investigation of like what are the readings in this class and like this is at the college level. This is not at all appropriate. It's totally outside of the norm. Anyways, La Presse has this big long piece about how basically the profs at the college are feeling like totally intimidated and the education minister is getting in there. And then they go into the fact that the education minister was on the board of CJA Quebec for like 6 years, from like 2016 to 2022, until like just before she becomes the minister. And I didn't know that. I didn't know that. And like, that's wild, right? It's wild. I mean, I follow this stuff, and I didn't know Quebec's, and she's been all, around McGill encampment, terrible statements. No one talks about it. She's been on the board of CJ Quebec, and it's possible I'd heard it about at one point, but it's wild. I'm basically certain I hadn't heard it. Or if I heard it, I heard it very briefly. And that's because it's all like, you don't do that, right? That's not acceptable. No one, both even at the left end, you don't talk about how this education minister is a longtime agent of the main Israel lobby group. That's just they don't. It's the corporate media won't do it for you. I mean, in this case, La Presse does, and it's because the union pushes back at Dawson and raise this matter. But you go online. Once you look at it, you go online. It's right away. You find it in a second. She's not. It's like on her LinkedIn or whatever. It's like right there. It's not at all obscure. So that's an interesting piece. Toronto, the Toronto District School Board, it seems to have taken this document that's about anti-Semitism a step forward, and in it explicitly labels anti-Zionism as anti-Semitism. One of the things that I thought was interesting in this is that the Toronto Holocaust Museum jumped in with the CJA and UJA Toronto and one or two other groups in like pushing this. And these Holocaust. I'm writing a piece about this about like in the make-believe world of Jewish Zionists, they're unfairly targeted, right? That's the make-believe world. In the real world, all of these genocidal Jewish Zionist institutions and individuals are basically given a pass, right? The Toronto Holocaust Museum and the Montreal Holocaust Museum, they've been promoting this Holocaust in Gaza, okay? Nothing. I've never heard of any picketing, rallying at the Holocaust museums. They get huge. The one in Montreal is getting huge, tens and tens of millions of dollars in public funds because they're building a new one on Saint Laurent Street, just off of downtown. And they're run by the federations. The federations, of course, fund CJA, and CJA is their advocacy agent. Themselves, the museums get directly involved. They have on the Toronto Holocaust Museum has a "We Support Israel" webpage, right? No one ever there hasn't been 75 plus years of ethnic cleansing, half a century of illegal occupation, 16 months of genocide in Gaza, not a single rally criticizing the Toronto Holocaust Museum, Montreal Holocaust Museum. And then you go down the line, you go to the Tannenbaum chat, the biggest private school, the IDF days. They send kids to go barbecue on Israeli military bases like they did a few months ago. Never been a rally there. There's never been a protest at Tenem Trump. Never been handing out leaflets. There's never even basically been any public criticism except for myself and Just Peace Advocates action alert. You go on and on and on, right? And so it's this is it's just that's the real world is that the Jewish Zionist genocidal Jewish Zionist institutions are completely left off the hook, and then you'll have in the conversations at Independent Jewish Voices when I write some article, you'll have wild back and forths with these people who will say, "Oh, Eve English being an anti-Semite." You'll have half people, a number of people will defend me and respond, but then you have a whole bunch of people, oh, you're being anti-Semitic. Oh, this is anti-Semitic. Not once will they talk about Tannenbaum Chat. Not once will they talk about the Holocaust Museum promoting genocide in Gaza. Not once will they talk about, on and all the different Jewish institutions that are promoting horrors in Gaza. That's the real world, which is that these organizations are given a pass because people are still overly sensitive about being maligned as anti-Jewish for opposing Israel's crimes. I'll leave it at that. And if Laura wants to be a co-host, I'll make Laura a co-host. If anyone has questions or comments, go ahead. Let's see. Okay, I just made you co-host, Laura. Sorry about that. I couldn't figure that out.
Okay, so we have Ifu's got his hand up first. Ifu, can you unmute, please, Ifu?
All right. Thanks for a great recap. I was wondering if you know of any resistance to what's going on with the Amazon workers in Quebec who were unionized, and then I believe all the plant was shut down. And I'm wondering if there was any some of us in Nova Scotia trying to figure out what's going on in Quebec and how it could be in solidarity, and if you know anything about that.
Well, I went to a big demo on Saturday. There was, I thought it was 3,000. I had a conversation with someone else. He said he actually did a count, and it was 2,000. The CSN organized it, which is the second federation, and they were the ones who had one of the distribution centers that unionized, and the issue wasn't just that it was the first unionized. I believe the second one in North America. There's the one in the New York area, and but the thing is that Quebec law, labor law, has a provision for a mandatory first contract, so they can basically, if there's, the union can turn to a mediator to impose a first contract. And what they've been doing in New York is, my understanding, not knowing all the details, is they just refuse to negotiate seriously with the union, and the union isn't really strong enough to be able to strike, and so the likely scenario what was going to happen here in Quebec was that it was going to a contract was going to be, collective agreement was going to be imposed on Amazon, which they desperately didn't want, and they were willing to shut down like the whole operation in Quebec, which ends up being like 4,500 people. So yeah, there was a demo on Saturday. I think it was considered a I didn't know if it was going to be like 300 people there. It was going to be 10,000 people. I didn't hear much about it before, but the CSN has their own kind of networks. I thought it was, you know, not a huge success, but certainly not a failure in terms of turnout. The issue's gotten a lot of attention here. Um, but yeah, I would, the people, at the CSN, someone like Mustafa Hemingway, who you may know, who's with he wrote a book about Amazon, but he was with the Immigrant Worker Center. I don't think he's still, he might still be working there. I'm not sure, but yeah. Anyway, so someone like that would be worth getting in touch with. And then there's people at the CSN, but I'm not. I'm very. I don't really know any of the organizing going on.
I was thinking, since there's this, okay, first of all, I have no respect for colonial boundaries, but I was wondering strategically with this pro-Canada move, there seems to be a lot of federal government support for Amazon in giving them contracts for different transportation things, and I was wondering if that could be an angle to get people to think about where is our money going and how are the corporations that our money's going to mistreating the workers in Canada. That was just something I was thinking.
Yeah, well,
Thank you.
but I would go further. I mean, I think it's like kind of like it's a good one where you can, it plays to like Jeff Bezos, this like hyper billionaire, with I don't know how strong a supporter of Trump he is, but he was there at the inauguration and sort of like this mix of like, anti-Trump, anti-oligarchic, kind of US kind of, it mixes together, attacking Canadian um, workers. It kind of mixes together as a kind of symbol of of resistance in this time that I think is a kind of a beyond the actual making punishing Amazon for what it's done, which is a very politicized move. I mean, it's Amazon is basically saying we're willing to shut down our whole operations in Quebec just because we don't want the success of one collective agreement, because that collective agreement could potentially then spread to their however many hundreds or thousands of distribution centers they have all around North America and that matter the world. So Amazon is so huge, they can be willing to take a huge loss over this, but it just makes sense as a anti-union strategy because their operations are so massive. So they have to pay a lot for you have to really it has to hurt. You have to do whatever you can to maximize it, even if you don't believe it's going to lead to them reversing course directly. The principle of the punishment. So I agree with you. Like all the government contracts to Amazon should be ended, and some of them have. There've been a bunch of announcements here. I don't know how serious. Politicians, the city of Montreal announced uh, canceling some stuff. I saw that headline. I don't know how the politicians announce these things while it's sort of like in the media, and then whether they follow through when there's less political heat on the issue is a different question. But yeah.
Lynn, can you unmute, please? Oh, I'm sorry, Lynn. I might have. Can you unmute, please, Lynn? All right, I'll try to unmute you again, but it's not working. Lynn, are you able to unmute?
Yeah,
Okay.
I just wanted to say anti-Semitism is just not, I don't want to hear it anymore. It's just like it's so reductive. It just means hate. Like, yeah, I know they both sides hate each other. So what? Like, I don't want to hear you say that again, Eves. Just don't say the stupid word. That's all.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's an interesting what the strategy is to undercut it. Is it mocking? I saw a thing saying actually get this. I saw this on Twitter. Took a photo of it. This is some meme that someone pointed out. Scientists warn that within 6 months, humanity will run out of things to call anti-Semitic. I thought that was kind of funny. But it's obviously very powerful, right? Like just I guess yesterday there was a swastika posted on a synagogue here in Montreal and Westmount, and I just saw Mark Carney, Pierre Poilievre, they all like had put out statements. And who know, I have no idea what, like, I don't, I'd say at least 25% chance it's like a Jewish pro-Israel supporter that did this, right? Like if you look at the past, it's at least plausible that's what happened. I don't know, I have no information one way or another. But like that you get like widespread and then all the pro-Israel types come in and they use this and they so it still plays its political, it still has political weight in the mainstream, but not just in the mainstream, right? It still had, and that's why I mentioned that like that conversation, the way to, and I think it really is important to contrast the amount of attention, even in left circles, even and specifically Jewish left circles, but left circles more generally, there will be more conversation about anti-Jewishness than there will be conversation about
Why?
that school that promotes the Israeli military, that Holocaust museum that promotes Israel's genocide in Gaza. And so, like that's why I think it really is valuable to point that contradiction out, point that double standard. It's like, okay, you really believe it's a bigger problem that like there's something in an article that I or some other leftist wrote that can be interpreted in a way that reinforces a trope that's even if you agree with your reading of that, even if you like somebody who's like very sensitive on this issue, and even if you agree with your reading of that, you think that's a bigger problem or that deserves more attention than a school, the biggest private school in the country, having IDF days, sending kids to go barbecue on Israeli military bases amidst the genocide in Gaza. Like, so I think that and obviously, specifically talking about independent Jewish voices, and it generalizes to Jewish Canadians more generally. They are the ones that are uh, uh, most, I guess, responsible. I don't know if that's the exact right word, but that it's incumbent on them to take on
Okay, just a second, hun.
Tannenbaum chat, to take on the fact that the Holocaust museums are promoting genocide, because they're the ones who are more protected, not protected, but they're more protected from the attacks saying, "Oh, this is just anti-Jewish," da 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 da. So there is yeah, I mean, I guess it's sort of like a need to put pressure on the most obvious is IJV because it's the biggest of the groups in this world. But to put pressure on a group like that to do a whole lot more in terms of subverting the Jewish Zionist institutions that basically get a complete pass.
Emily, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Yeah, sorry, I had to take my headsets off. I've got grandchildren doing homework here. Yeah, I just wanted to make a quick comment or share what I've been doing and having to initiate conversations actually with people who are up in arms about the tariffs, and then gets to NATO and confusion about who's doing what and who's gonna save Canada, etc. The EU, and then on top of that, then all the rhetoric against China causing all the problems and fears about Trump talking to Putin and blah blah blah. But anyway, what I have found very effective is to propose to people in initiating a discussion with what is going on in the US with the amount of protests that are going on that mainstream media doesn't report. In the event that that was whatever's going on internally to the United States, that and there are oligarchs in power, et cetera, and the Democrats are complaining. But if the U.S. were another, if there was another country called the U.S. that was looking at what's going on in the U.S., and who would the U.S. that U.S. that's intervening side with, right? The quote unquote insurrectionists in the street, or with the oligarchs? And I've had some interesting conversations to start it off that way about oh, well, definitely, they would, do this or that. And then we get into talking about militarism and South America and, other countries, the decades where the US has intervened to support dictatorships. So anyway, so I found that as a nice little tool for introducing a discussion.
But doesn't that presume some degree of understanding of how the US operates and
Yes, and you know what? That's where I can use my clinical skills in finding out where their head is at and doing some education. Absolutely. Yes. Because then I can propose, why don't you read this or take a look at that, or I can give them a reference, right? See how far they want to go with it. And so I found it very effective as a tool for beginning education. But absolutely, it means I would not use that with everyone, but I'm selective, and also I am prepared to spend time with them to see where they're coming from and what their level of knowledge is. And people have been quite surprised to learn, right?
In talking to people, do you think that like people are, when they think of Canada being under the thumb of the threats from Trump, that they broaden things and they say like, Trump's just this bullying all around the world, and the US is a bully, and we should have solidarity with people in Panama, or they don't even necessarily
Oh
register?
God, no, no, a lot of people don't even see it that way. It's interesting because I've been sending love letters to Charlie Angus to his parliamentary email address over the last few days because he's got all this stuff on the Facebook page, like he's at this conference in Brussels and he's lamenting that nobody paid attention to him and treating it totally very much as a issue of sentimentality. But he's certainly missing the mark. I'm shocked at his lack of analysis of Canada's role and the role of NATO. And like, oh,
When someone sent me a piece he wrote.
so his big worry now is that, oh, Putin and Trump are talking, so they're going to just take the world. Like, holy Jesus, like, give me a break. So I've been sending stuff to him, and there are a couple of other people on the Facebook that some other guy that we've been sending him stuff every time he puts up this silly Facebook thing about what he's doing, and he's fighting back, and he's, I don't know, what are your objectives here, right?
The Ukraine one is really people are it's overwhelming among even like NDP circles. They're still completely boxed into it's just bad Putin, and bad Putin wants to take over all of Europe, and it's just like Chamberlain and appeasement and this and that. And I saw a clip from George Monbiot, who was, some things was sort of good environmental, kind of anti-corporate, Guardian columnist. And he's been, quite bad on all kinds of geopolitical issues for a number of years, but this was really extreme clip about him and appeasement, and next thing Putin's going to take over all of Western Europe kind of thing, and that's where Charlie Angus is at, from my understanding.
Eve, just before we go, can you tell me, has the Canadian government come out against Trump's ethnic cleansing plan for Gaza? Have they?
Not, I mean, sort of. I think Jolie took time, was really slow, and then she posted this thing 24 hours later that saying, our position hasn't changed. We don't believe it does references ethnic cleansing. And then a couple days later, but not direct, doesn't respond to it. It's just a general sort of statement that's obviously in response. And then a couple days later, she was quoted in I think she wouldn't directly criticize it, but I think she might have used the word abhorrent or something like that. Or I think so really trying to sort of say we still believe in a two-state solution. We don't believe in driving all Palestinians out, but we won't actually criticize what Trump's floated. And so
Easily.
yes, sort of, but not really. But
Okay. All right. I think we can let you go. Thanks so much. That was a great session.
take care, everyone. See ya.
Thank you, everyone. Well.